Welcome to part 2 of my video tutorial for how to make a 2x2x3 slim tower. Before we get back into the actual aspects of constructing the puzzle, what I'd like to do is I'd like to discuss the tools and materials I specifically use for making my slim towers. For starters, obviously you need a standard Rubik's Cube. This is a 3x3x3, 57 millimeters across, just your typical Rubik's Cube. You also have to have a keychain cube, of course. This one happens to be a 30 millimeter one from Rubix.com. Other necessary materials: a little bit of 2-part epoxy. This is one of the 5-minute set varieties. This is just clear. There is a plastic epoxy that comes in like a cloudy color. I really don't recommend using that. It's very, very smelly and very foul material to work with. I don't use it. Of course, adhesive-wise, a little super glue, always great to have. Another material I like to use is a little bit of epoxy sculpt. It's my personal preference. I use it for a lot of builds. Anything that calls for epoxy putty, this is what I use. Of course, you have to have a cutter of some kind to be able to cut plastic, whatever. Very useful tool to have, and of course that's what I use to cut the feet off of my cubes. Razor saw, for when you don't want to use a Dremel. Razor saw is very, very handy for that purpose, and allows you to make, cuts with less noise, less danger, less smell, etc. Now, I do use a Dremel a lot, and when I use that, the particular bits that I use the most are the standard cutting wheel. It's just a emery cutter. I also, of course, use a drum sanding bit. Very, very useful. And finally, this is a coarse cutting shaping wheel. You don't have to have both the emery wheel and this cutting wheel. You don't have to have both, but I like having both. They both have their specific uses. So I use these three the most. Craft knife, gotta have one. You also could use some plastic card, and again, like I said before, you don't have any plastic card, you could certainly use some credit cards, cut up credit cards, or various other cheap cards for this purpose. Finally, well, not so finally, this is what I use for this particular build, and although it might strike you a little bit odd, these are post-it notes. Two post-it note packages. Color doesn't matter, but you need to have the same variety. Larger ones, approximately this size, 2 inches. What's that? 73 millimeters. So 2 of these. What I don't have showing right now is, of course, some sandpaper. I like grit mainly between 100 and 200 grit. And finally some rubber bands, which I don't have here either. Rubber bands, maybe about 4 or 5 of them, just medium sized. Okay, so let's just put this back in frame because, again, I feel that this is quite important for a lot of builds. Okay, what I wanted to discuss a little bit before we continued on with the actual build itself was regarding keychain cubes. I've actually been asked by several people, which is, I thought it was a little bit odd that I wasn't clear enough on this, but the keychain cubes you should use, if possible, something like this. This particular one was bought at some chain drugstore. Inexpensive, 30 millimeters. Again, I just cut off the little chains that they don't need because these poor fellows won't be long for this world in this shape. If you are lucky, what you can find sometimes is some of these. Now, these are the 20 millimeter ones. I'm not saying this particular one, but rather this particular package. I find that the black package ones, the 30 millimeter size, specifically like this one, they actually make great cores for puzzles too, but for a different reason than these, and we'll get to that in just a moment. Now, there are 2 kinds of keychain cubes, primary kinds that are floating around, that I refer to as hollow and solid. This one here is from the new packaging. This is a hollow Rubik's Cube. While this old fellow from the 80s is actually a solid one. And I said that in some ways this is a preferable one to this one, and I'll show you why that is. Now, if we open this sucker up and look at the pieces, what you will see is that the hollow ones, or excuse me, the solid ones, have most of the inside of the puzzle itself. I mean, it's dominated by a big hole, but it's a circular hole and the walls are very well supported compared to, for example, a hollow one, which does not have very well supported walls. And let me just draw that out for you because it might not be very easy to see. But the hollow one looks something like this. The walls themselves, when you look down into the puzzle itself, are very, very thin. Now again, when you're talking about a full-size puzzle, this doesn't make a lot of difference. However, on something the size of a keychain cube, it actually makes quite a bit of difference, because we're going to cut quite a bit of it off to begin with. In the case of a solid one, it looks like this, where the piece has a big hole in it, but the walls are still significantly thicker than the small walls on a hollow piece. For the corner pieces, actually, I'm not too worried about whether the piece is a hollow piece or a solid piece. Where I really start making the distinction, where it really becomes important, is in the case of the edge pieces. The edge pieces, if you recall, again, some of these edge pieces need to be cut at a diagonal. The diagonal piece that needs to be cut is in many ways similar to the earlier edge piece that we cut from the piece to make, of course, our edges. And the reason it's significant is because if you look at the cut that's made, you can see that this piece, the edge piece here of a hollow puzzle, is very, very thin. There's very little material here, and it frankly easily breaks. That's not too good. So in order for this edge piece to be viable, you actually have to fill it with epoxy putty. And you can see that I've done a little bit of filling here, a little two-part epoxy, filled in the gap. In order to fill the piece, the edge piece, with a little bit of epoxy, like so, what you need to do is, very simply, take a bit of your plastic card here, and when you're about to push the putty into the hole, all you do is take your bit of plastic card, moisten it, get it a little bit damp, just rest it up against here, and then just push your putty in, like so. Okay, and then once you've got it in nice and tight, if this is nice and wet, it won't stick to the putty, and you'll get a nice smooth surface. And again, we need this puzzle to be as smooth as possible, and that will prevent the edge piece from ever breaking. And even if you broke that piece, it doesn't matter, because since it's filled up with a solid block of epoxy, you won't have a problem. But again, if you can find yourself a solid piece, see these tiny little holes, that's about all you have to worry about, and there's really, you don't have to fill them. This puzzle is well supported and strong enough from the inside where you don't have to do this. So this is actually a savings of a few minutes. And it can actually add up if you're not very good at playing with epoxy putty. So once you have your corners, or I'm sorry, your edges of the keychain cube filled in, then you're pretty much ready to start the assembly process for your core. And again, this core is just cut down piece. I'm not going to get into how that's done quite yet. Honestly, I'll be honest with you. I mean, if you just look at the picture, you can see that all of these corners need to be cut off a certain degree, cut more than half. But we will get into how to do that anyway. But that's all for the moment, and hopefully we'll get to the actual building process, at least of the core, next, and then after that we'll tackle how to assemble the middle edges, which on a slim tower are actually the most important pieces that you can put on. I know that some builders like to approach from the corners first, but in my opinion, it's the middle edges. Those are the most important parts, and we'll get to that eventually. One final quick note about hollow versus solid cubes. Just because you have the black package does not guarantee you a solid cube, and just because you have one of these packages does not mean that you will have a hollow cube, although usually it does. So just keep that in mind. Don't go out of your way looking for a solid cube. We can still make a great puzzle even if you don't have a solid one.